Before the Great War, Pittsburgh was known for its steel production, mass-producing weapons, munitions, and robots for the military to use against China, something their enemy was aware of and wanted to stop. So, when the war escalated and China had almost lost, many industrious cities, including Pittsburgh, were targeted by enemy warheads and destroyed. Following the Great War, the city fell into chaos, with survivors fighting to establish their own spheres of influence, and while the city was left with an abundance of steel to rebuild with, the survivors couldn't spare the manpower or the time, as all efforts went towards defending against rival gangs, and that's all they did for 26 years. But in 2103, the most violent gangs got the bright idea to join forces, reshaping themselves into the Fanatics. Using their combined strength, they enslaved the other survivors and started rebuilding a settlement called the Pitt. Those fortunate enough to evade capture went one of two ways. They either left in search of a new home, which some of them did find in Appalachia, or they joined the Union, a resistance confederation made up entirely of Pittsburgh residents. These two factions became the main players vying for dominance, and the two sides were evenly matched in terms of power and territory, until the Fanatics decided to tip the scales in their favor by hiring a ruthless mercenary group known as the Hellcats. For 18 months, the Hellcats were used as meat shields. They were sent headfirst into Union bases and safe houses, killing anyone who dared fight back. And to make things even more dangerous, the mercenaries saw fratricide on a daily basis, thanks to the Fanatics' inability to tell friend from foe. That's not to say they didn't have their own capable people too. In fact, a major turning point in the war was all thanks to a single man, a Fanatic tracker named D. With D's abilities, the Fanatics were able to locate the Union's main safe house in the trench, an old cathedral known as the Sanctum, a place that was hard to get to but poorly defended. Still, thanks to D, the Fanatics seized the cathedral and transformed it from a place of refuge into hell on earth, a place where prisoners were taken, tortured, and turned into broken slaves, or used as food to feed the trogs, which is something I'll come back to in just a moment. As for the Hellcats, they left as soon as their contract was up. They had suffered horrific casualties, estimated to be about 50% of their entire force, and aside from a few mercenaries who wanted to stay, the majority of them left to find safer contracts elsewhere. Without the Hellcats, the Fanatics struggled to deal with the remaining survivors. The war had again reached a stalemate. Regardless, the conflict continued to rage, even as Vault Dwellers from Vault 76 came to intervene, although their impact on the city's power struggle seems to have made very little difference in the long run, and several decades later, things haven't changed, but the same cannot be said for the residents' health. Thanks to the confluence of rivers that flow through Pittsburgh, radioactive fallout from as far as Maryland and West Virginia have flowed into the city, poisoning the groundwater. What's more is that water then mixed with mutagenic agents, chemicals used by the city's industries, creating a deadly environment unique to the area. As a result of this strange and toxic combination, the residents of the Pitt have started to change, physically and mentally. At first it seemed like the longer someone lived in the Pitt, the more aggressive they became, but soon enough, the children were turning too. This neurological condition would later be known as the troglytic degeneration contagion, or TDC. Those suffering with TDC came to be known as wild men on account of their wild behavior. Then something happened. A small percentage of wild men regressed even further. They moved into the shadows, started crawling around on all fours, they stopped wearing clothes, they rarely spoke, and when they did, it was seldom more than a few words. There was something within the city, a disease caused by radiation and pollution that was turning people into wild animals, or as the locals call them, trogs. No one really understood why this was happening, and they had no idea how to prevent it either. It seemed as though it chose at random, but one thing they came to learn was that every last child born in TDC active areas, pretty much everywhere they had built, eventually turned into trogs. As a result, the Pitt's population plummeted. Some died from radiation, Most were killed by rival gangs or became wild men or trogs, while few found areas free of TDC and had children. But it was never enough to rebuild. The pit was far too gone. That was until a group of Brotherhood soldiers from Washington, D.C. decided to loot the city and wipe it off the map. Even though they were outnumbered and outgunned, Lion soldiers had superior weapons, training, and power armor, giving them a clear advantage over the disorganized raiders, the feral creatures, and the survivors too, who were caught in the crossfire. In a single night, the Pitt's population was reduced by half. The Brotherhood took everything they deemed useful, including non-mutated children, and they destroyed everything else.
Now that's a story. The only reason I'm here is because of Elder Lyons. You see, I grew up in the Pit. Don't suppose you ever been there, huh? It's about 500 clicks to the northwest. Place is a nightmare. 3 irradiated rivers coming together. People there were not well. But the Brotherhood of Steel came down on the place with a righteous hammer. They called it the Scourge. It was a Brotherhood operation. They marched in and swept the place clean. Most of the people there were half-mutated, cancerous, vile things. And these people, rape gangs, torture squads. It was pure chaos there. The Scourge is the best thing that could have happened to it.
During the Scourge, the Brotherhood suffered only a single casualty, an initiate named Ishmael Asher. Now the Pit had useful technology, but it was suicide to stay there, so when an explosion left Asher buried in the mill, his brothers were sure he was dead, and he doesn't blame them for leaving. He probably would have left as well, as the Brotherhood was certain that nothing could really live in the Pit. But they were wrong. Unbeknownst to Lyons, Asher was still alive, and he woke to someone pulling him out of the rubble. At first, he thought it was his brothers pulling him to safety. Instead, it was a scavenger trying to steal his armor. She didn't get it, but he did learn that she had a whole family of scavengers. They'd make raids into the city for gear from the mill, and that gave him an idea. This was the only working steel mill he had ever seen. In a world of leftovers, it was a chance to build again, and that was worth any price. Thanks to his armor and the countless corpses the Brotherhood had left in their wake, the scavengers mistook him for a god. So along with his Brotherhood know-how, it was easy to set up the basics, and they started to build a new city. As word of a new settlement got out, the city started growing, and fast. When raiders attacked, he'd kill the leader and recruit the rest. He had to. The city's disease meant they couldn't have children, so recruiting was the only way to grow. And as the city grew, the mill needed more workers. And yes, that meant recruiting workers by force. The children Lyons had left behind grew up and joined Asher's army, or they became slaves. Wabash Bridge, the only access to and from the Pit, became a trap for both stragglers trying to leave the city and scavengers trying to enter. People caught using the bridge were captured and forced to work in the steel yard. Any material they found was sold for caps. Caps used to buy more slaves from places like Paradise Falls in DC. Unsurprisingly, the slaves soon outnumbered the soldiers, leading Asher to recruiting people who didn't object to slavery, mostly raiders from outside the city. But there was also a small percentage of slaves who became soldiers after earning their freedom fighting in the hole. Either way, Asher's army is primarily made up of raiders who are prone to cruelty, so trying to escape is natural. Only their chances of getting out alive are slim. The river is too toxic and too strong to swim across, and the bridge is riddled with traps and raiders who shoot on sight. Now Asher doesn't like calling the slaves slaves, instead insisting they are to be called workers because they can actually earn their freedom. Their position is temporary, and that goes both ways. His soldiers can also become slaves. Food was always an issue, but the raiders ate well, better than most, either using slaves to scavenge the ruins, or eating food imported or stolen from outside the city. The slaves, on the other hand, got the bare minimum, and sometimes they didn't even get that, which has led to them eating the only thing the raiders don't dare touch, a dish locally known as slop.
You must be new here. I serve the slop to the other slaves. You want food? Let me know. The good news is that this crap is nearly unlimited, but it's mostly radiated water and trog meat anyway. I'm not sure if this stuff will kill you faster than starvation or not.
Despite the odds, Lord Asher had conquered the pit. The steel mill was alive, his army guarded the slaves, they watched the city's entrance, put up floodlights to scare off trogs, and shot wild men on sight. It had taken him 20 years, but the city was undeniably his. However, there was still one thing that needed to be fixed. A crucial obstacle to securing the pit's future was overcoming the mysterious contagion. And Asher knew that as long as TDC existed, his city's population would always rely on the outside world, and for the first time, there was nothing he could do to change that. But there was someone else who wanted to try, Sandra Kundanika. Little is known about Sandra, only that she willingly traveled to the pit after hearing about its status as an up-and-coming civilization. Over the coming months, Sandra researched the epidemic, which she named Troglytic Degeneration Contagion, or TDC, and it's thanks to her efforts that we know so much about it. Even so, Sandra was unable to cure TDC, and to make matters worse, she was now pregnant with Asher's child in a TDC active area. But a few weeks after giving birth, Sandra realized that their daughter, Marie, was special. She was born with a natural immunity to both radiation and TDC. This revelation got her parents thinking. Perhaps they could harness Marie's natural immunity and develop a cure. A cure would remove the necessity to rely on outside sources for population growth, as the residents of the pit would be able to reliably procreate. And without TDC being an immediate threat, there would eventually be no more wild men, and no more trogs either. Asher's goal was to create a strong foundation for a future nation. In 20 years, he had established an army, an industry, and he was close to having a solution to the radiation and contamination. Imagine what he could do with 20 more. Although, not everyone was willing to wait that long. Shortly after the Scourge, Medea was born. She had spent her entire life working in the mill as a slave, until one day she decided to try her luck in the hole. We don't know how many other slaves she had to kill to earn her freedom, but she did, and upon doing so, she could join Asher, or she could leave. Unexpectedly, Medea didn't join Asher, but she also didn't leave. Instead, she started living alongside the slaves as a free woman. Her reason for doing this was because she wanted to save them, but she didn't know how she would do that, until she was approached by Werner. Werner used to be Asher's second in command, until he tried and failed to become the new Lord of the Pit by killing Asher. As a result, Werner was stripped of his position and sent to the pens, and that is where he should have stayed. But Werner was familiar with the raiders' schedules. He knew how they operated, and he used that information to escape. And the first thing he did was find Medea. He knew she wanted to free the slaves, which in turn would dethrone Asher. After telling Medea about the cure, Werner convinced her that if they were able to steal Marie, then they would be able to make a cure much quicker than Sandra could, since they weren't the child's parents and didn't have to take as many precautions to keep her safe. Even though this would free the slaves, Medea is well aware of how bad things used to be before Asher took over, and sometimes she thinks that despite their questionable conditions, they are actually better off with him in charge. But after Werner's words of encouragement, she was willing to chance it for the immediate freedom of her people. So together they devised a plan. To recruit an outsider, someone willing to become a slave, someone willing to risk their life in the hole, and in the event they survived, join the raiders, gain access to Haven, and then, if everything went according to plan, steal the cure. This plan, despite it having so many chances to go wrong, was agreed upon. Only then did Werner leave the pit. Traveling to Washington, D.C., he went to the nearest radio tower he could find and started broadcasting a radio distress call in the hopes of finding someone who could help.
To anyone who can hear me, my name is Werner. I come from a settlement to the north. I have information of great value to anyone willing to help me free my people. Please, help us. This message repeats.
As of right now, we don't know the outcome of their plan, and it's always difficult ending a video that doesn't really have an ending. So, let me know in the comments who you sided with and your reasons for doing so. Be sure to show your support by liking the video and subscribing if you haven't already for more Fallout content. If there's anything you'd like to see in a later video, leave a comment and I'll see what I can do. With that said, thank you, as always, for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.